Today I want to share with you a touching story of Owen, an Apache rancher who longed for a plain, steady bride to help him survive the harsh desert. Yet when the train arrived, fate brought him hope. A woman of striking beauty, carrying secrets of her own. Now let us begin. The Arizona Territory in the summer of 1887 was a land of cracked earth and unforgiving skies. Heat shimmered across the hardpan flats, turning the horizon into a wavering mirage. The yucca and muska trees stood gray and brittle, their branches sharp as bone, while dust clouds spiraled up like restless spirits chasing the wind. Vultures traced lazy circles high above, searching for what little life the desert might surrender. A mile east of the Caracoa Range, a small homestead clung to the land. It was no more than a weathered cabin of rough hune pine. Its roof patched with tarp paper and rusted tin and a lean-to barn that leaned harder with every storm. Fences sagged where barbed wire had rusted loose. Inside the corral, a handful of goats nosed the dirt, ribs showing beneath their hides as they searched in vain for something green. The men who kept this place looked as worn as the land itself. Owen, 34 years old, of the Chiricahua Apache, carried in his bearing the weight of battles fought and loved ones buried. His face was darkened by years beneath the sun. His eyes sharp but shadowed, his long black hair strewn with dust. Scars latticed his forearm, some from the war years, others from barbed wire and stubborn tools. His body had endured both musket fire and the stubborn grind of drought. Yet it was his silence that made him seem older than his years. Once he had fought in. Discover more. Free transcription service. Video transcription service. Document translation service. The mountains when Geronimo's band refused surrender. He had known the crack of rifles in narrow canyons, the smoke of burning camps, the cries of families caught in the sweep of cavalry. When the wars ended, Owen had been forced onto the reservation like so many of his people. There, soldiers counted heads and rations, and disease took more than hunger ever had. Within a single week, smallpox claimed his wife and infant son. He buried them beneath cottonwoods near the San Carlos agency, then turned his back in a life of waiting for handouts. He left with little more than an old rifle, a few goats, and a will to survive on his own terms. Through barter and sweat he laid claim to this stretch of land, not because he trusted deeds and papers, but because it lay within sight of the mountains his ancestors had known. For 3 years he had endured here, mending fences, coaxing corn from hard soil, drawing what water he could from a failing well. The land took its payment in blood and sweat, but it also gave him something the reservation never had, a measure of freedom. Still the cost of solitude was heavy. Each morning he rose before dawn, built a fire from scat branches, and went about chores in silence. He spoke to the goats sometimes or to the wind, but the silence pressed down like a stone. Trips into Tombstone for supplies brought no comfort. Conversations fell quiet when he entered the general store. Some men called him chief with mocking grins. Others looked through him as though he were a shadow. Children stared. Women crossed the street. He bore it without words, but it wore on him. By the summer of '87, the drought deepened. The well yielded water thick with mud. His goats bleated for grazing that no longer grew. Even the sky seemed empty of mercy. For the first time, Owen admitted what he had resisted. A man could not stand against this country alone. He needed another set of hands, another presence in the house. He needed a wife. Not for romance. He had buried that part of himself with his first family, but for survival, a partner to share the labor of tending animals, hauling water, and preparing for winter. Someone who understood endurance, not illusions. The thought had taken root after he had found a discarded newspaper from Kansas City, its pages wrapping a sack of flour. Among the advertisements for patent medicines and farm tools, was a notice for a matrimonial agency. The words were plain. Men and women of practical spirit matched for mutual survival. For weeks, Owen stared at the scrap of newsprint by lamplight. The idea felt foreign, seeking a wife through letters. Asking strangers to choose one for him. Yet the silence of the house reminded him daily what was missing. At last one night he took up a pencil stub and scratched out a letter. He wrote nothing flowery, only the truth. He described his homestead, the harsh land, the drought, and the need for a partner willing to work beside him. He did not ask for beauty or youth, only strength and steadiness. The next morning, he carried the folded letter into Tombstone. The postmaster read the name on the envelope and raised a brow. Kansas City, the man asked, but Owen offered no explanation. The letter slid into the outgoing sack, and with it went a piece of his guarded laugh. Back in the street, Owen felt eyes on him from every doorway and window. "Mail order Brad," someone muttered with an Apache. The words buzzed like flies. He ignored them, mounted his wagon, and rode home. In the days that followed, he patched the barn roof, mended the corral, and dug deeper into the well, though it gave little more than mud. Each evening he sat at his table, eating beans in silence, his eyes drifting to the empty chair across from him. He remembered his wife's laughter, the sound of his child's first cry, the warmth that had once filled a home now hollow. He knew he could not replace the dead. But perhaps another soul might one day sit across from him, not as replacement, but as proof that life went on. The desert was ruthless, but it taught a lesson he could not ignore. Nothing survived alone. The coyote scavenged after the hawk. The bat carried the pollen of the cactus flower. Even the mountains fed the valleys as their cliffs crumbled into soil. A man who tried to live apart from all others was no stronger than a tree uprooted from its roots. Through July into August, the heat only sharpened. The sky was a polished dome of blue without a single cloud. The ground split into cracks wide enough to catch a boot heel. Owen stored beans in burlap sacks, counted the goats, and waited. Somewhere east of the Mississippi, his letter traveled, perhaps already discarded, perhaps being read by a stranger deciding his worth. Late one afternoon, thunderheads gathered over the distant mountains, but refused to break. Owen stood on his porch, watching dust devils dance across the plain. The silence around him was deep enough to hear his own breath. He had thrown his hope into the wind on a sheet of paper. Whether it would return as salvation or nothing at all remained beyond his control. For now he was what the desert had made him. A solitary man standing against the horizon, waiting. 6 weeks after Owen sent his letter, he had almost convinced himself no reply would come. The desert was used to silence, and he figured the agency in Kansas City had tossed his request aside once they saw the name of an Apache. Then one hot evening, the telegraph boy from Tombstone arrived at his gate with a slip of paper. Bride arriving Tombstone Depot. September 3, noon train. The words were as stark as the land itself. A woman was coming. Someone had read his plain request and chosen to stake her life on it. Owen folded the telegram carefully, as though it might crumble, and tucked it into his vest. That night he sat long at his table, listening to the emptiness of the house, aware that it would soon change. On the morning of September 3, he rose before dawn. He washed with the murky water from the well, shaved with a dull razor, and pulled on his best shirt, clean but threadbare. His trousers were patched, his vest old but solid. He polished his boots until the leather showed a dull shine, then hitched the horses to his wagon. By the time the sun climbed over the mountains, he was already on the road to Tombstone. The journey was 15 millas of dust and silence. Mosquito and sage brushed against the wagon wheels, and the mountains shifted slowly in the distance. Owen kept his eyes ahead, steadying his breath against the weight of what awaited him. When he reached town, it was clear the news had spread. Men leaned against railings. Women stood in doorways. Children followed him with wide eyes. By the time he tied his team near the depot, a crowd had already gathered, eager for spectacle. "That's him," someone whispered. "The Apache with a mail-order bride." Owen ignored them. He took his place on the platform, broad shoulders straight, hands folded loosely at his belt. He stared down the tracks, waiting. The whistle came first, then the plume of black smoke. The locomotive thundered in, steam hissing as brakes squealed. Passengers spilled onto the platform, salesmen with heavy cases. Is a family herding children, an old woman clutching a carpet bag. And then she appeared. She stepped from the passenger car with one gloved hand on the rail, pausing a moment as though measuring the crowd before her. She was younger than he had expected, no more than 26, with chestnut hair drawn neatly beneath a modest traveling hat. Her dress was plain grey, serviceable, yet even in simplicity she carried herself with a grace that caught every eye. The platform grew hushed. Owen felt the weight of it, the murmurs, the judgment. He had asked for someone plain, someone who would pass unnoticed. This woman, without trying, commanded the space around her. She lifted her chin and descended the steps, carrying a single trunk. Her eyes, gray-blue like storm clouds over the mountains, searched until they found him. She walked directly toward him, unflinching beneath the stairs. "You are Amr Obin," she asked, her voice calm, clear. "I am," he said. "I am Hope Donovan." For a moment that was enough. Then, aware of the crowd pressing in, Owen bent to take her trunk. "The wagon is this way." Their hands brushed briefly on the handle. She let go, allowing him to lift it, and together they crossed the platform. Baying them, whispers swelled like flies. "She's too fine for him. No woman comes west unless she's running from something. Mark me, that girl brings trouble." Ope did not turn her head. She stepped into the wagon seat with quiet dignity, and Owen climbed up beside her. With a click of his tongue, he set the horses moving, leaving the crowd to their gossip. The road stretched wide and empty. Dust rose behind the wheels, the sun pressed down. For a long time, they rode in silence. Ope sat straight, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Obin stole glances at her profile, wondering what past she carried, what desperation had driven her this far. "It is not what you expected," he said at last, gesturing toward the barren land spreading before them. "I expected nothing," she replied evenly. "Expectations are luxuries I can no longer afford." Her words struck him harder than the sun. He nodded once, and they fell silent again. By late afternoon, the mountains rose sharp and close, and his homestead came into view. The weathered cabin, the sagging barn, the goat pen beside a gnarled moose quiet. Hope leaned forward slightly, studying it, but made no comment. "There it is," Owen said. "It is very quiet," she murmured. "Lonely," he corrected. She turned her storm-colored eyes to him. "Sometimes lonely is what a person needs." He looked away, clicking to the horses' sauces. When they stopped, Hope climbed down before he could offer a hand. She stood in the yard shading her eyes, taking in the cabin, the barren garden, the cracked saw stretching to the horizon. The goats bleated faintly, breaking the silence. Obin carried her trunk to the porch. "I'll show you inside." The cabin was spare. A table and 2 chairs, shelves with a few tin dishes, a small stove, a bed in the adjoining room. Everything was clean but plain, marked by the absence of touch. Obin moved through it quietly, her gaze sharp, but without reproach. "Eat this small," Owen said. "Eat this shelter," she answered. That evening she prepared a meal from beans and cornmeal. They ate in near silence, the lamplight soft against the rough hewn walls. Across the table she sat with a poise that suggested long practice. Yet her eyes held shadows he could not name. When the meal was done, she set her spoon aside. "We should be clear, Amr Obin. He did not come seeking romance. He came seeking survival. If we are to live as partners, I will do my part. He asked the same of you." Her words matched the heart of the letter he had sent, though hearing them aloud unsettled him. He inclined his head. "That is what I asked." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "It has been a long journey, if you'll excuse me." She stepped into the smaller room, leaving him at the table. Through the thin walls he heard the faint sounds of unpacking, the creak of boards, the rustle of fabric. Ordinary noises, yet they filled the cabin in a way silence never had. Owen sat a long time, staring at the flame of the lamp. He had wanted someone plain, invisible. Instead, the agency had sent him a woman who drew notice without effort. He had asked for simplicity. He had been given hope. Outside, the desert wind swept around the cabin, carrying with it the uneasy promise of change. The first days after Hope's arrival passed in a quiet rhythm, cautious but steady. At dawn, Owen stepped outside to tend the goats, while the desert still held a trace of coolness. He found, to his surprise, that the cabin smelled of coffee when he returned. Seen but hot, brewed from beans she had discovered in his supplies. She moved about the small kitchen with an economy of motion. Her sleeves rolled back, her hair braided tight. She asked no needless questions. She learned by watching how to pump the stubborn handle of the well, how to gather moss quiet branches for the stove, how to sift beans for stones. By the second morning, she had taken over the cooking, declaring simply, "You'll work better with a full belly." Owen did not argue. The goats, wary of strangers, settled more quickly than he expected under her hand. Ope knelt among them without hesitation, checking hooves, riding a gift that had stumbled. Owen watched from a distance, the sun on his shoulders, and thought of how few women from the east would ever lay hands on such animals without complaint. Still, he held himself apart. At night, after the meal, they sat across from each other at the table, speaking little. She asked once about the nearest town, and he told her Tombstone lay 15 millas west. She asked about neighbors, and he said the Alvarez family kept a small place to the south, though miles of dust lay between. After that, her questions ended. They lived side by side, strangers bound by necessity. It was on the fourth evening that the desert broke. All day the sky had held a strange stillness. The heat pressed down heavier than usual, the air thick enough to taste. Toward sunset, clouds boiled up from the horizon, dark, swollen, unfamiliar. After months of drought, a gust of wind tore across the plain, scattering dust and bending moss-white branches. Ope stood on the porch, shading her eyes. Rain? Owen's step beside water, scanning the horizon. His chest tightened. More than rain. The storm arrived within violence. Sheets of water hammered the earth, flattening sage and yucca, turning dust into sucking mud. Thunder rolled like cannon fire. Lightning split the sky in jagged streaks. Within minutes, the dry wash behind the barn became a roaring torrent. Then came the goats' cries. Water poured into the corral, rising fast around the animals' thin legs. Panic sent them milling, bleeding, eyes rolling white. Owen ran, boots sinking in mud, and hope followed without hesitation. "Drive them uphill," he shouted over the roar. Together they waded into the corral, rain blinding, mud sucking at their feet. Owen seized the nearest goat, shoving it toward the gate. Ope splashed through the rising water, skirts clinging heavy, clapping her hands, her voice sharp as she herded the animals. They worked side by side, forcing the terrified creatures through the gate up toward the higher slope near the moss quiet. The water kept rising. One small kid trapped against the corner of the fence cried thinly as the current tugged it off its legs. Ope lunged without thinking, arms plunging into the muddy swirl. She caught the kid against her chest, stumbling as the water dragged at her skirts. "Ope!" Owen shouted, reaching her just as she fought free. Together they stumbled clear of the corral. The kid pressed tight against her, its body trembling. By the time the last goat scrambled onto high ground, the corral was half submerged. Fencing splintered, boards cracked and floated away. The barn shuddered under the weight of the torrent, but held, groaning like a wounded animal. Drenched and breathless, Owen and Hope drove the herd higher to a rocky outcrop above the wash. Rain pounded their backs. Mud struck their faces, but neither faltered until the goats stood safe on dry ground, huddled together. At last Owen braced his hands on his knees, chest heaving. Ope sank beside him. The kid still cradled in her arms. She laughed once, half shock, half relief, and pressed her cheek to the wet fur. When the storm passed, the desert lay transformed. Pools of water glimmered in hollows, the air thick with the scent of wet sage. The corral lay in ruins, boards scattered like bones. Mud coated everything from the cabin walls to their own skin. They made their way back slowly, exhaustion in every step. Ope set the rescued kid down, and it tottered after its mother, bleeding weakly. Owen glanced at her then, and for the first time since she had arrived, he let himself smile. "You did not scare," he said simply, her grey blue eyes met his. There was no time for fear, but they stood there a moment, the rain dripping from their hair, the storm fading into silence around them. Something had shifted. No longer strangers merely bound by agreement, but partners who had fought side by side against the land itself. That night, after securing the goats near the rocky rise, they returned to the cabin. Mud streaked the floor as they entered. Owen collapsed onto the bench, muscles aching. Hope stoked the stove, set water to warm, and without a word handed him a cloth. He wiped mud from his face and arms, watching her move about the small space with steady hands. When she sat at the table across from him, her braid unmuted, wisps of hair plastered to her cheeks, he saw not the stranger who had stepped off the train, but the woman who had plunged into floodwaters for a helpless animal. You belong here more than most, he said quietly. Ope tilted her head, studying him. Belonging isn't something the land gives. It's something you take by staying. A nodded slowly. She understood more than he had expected. They ate a simple supper in weary silence, but the emptiness that had haunted the cabin felt less sharp. Outside, the night was alive with the chirping of inways newly awakened by rain. The desert smelled rich, alive, promising ceasing. Before turning in, Owen stepped to the doorway and looked out across the sodden land. Pools of water gleamed under the moonlight. The storm had left wreckage, but it had also given what the desert needed most, life. Behind him, hope settled into her narrow bed. He heard the faint rustle of her movement, the creak of timbers, the sigh of a weary body finding rest. Ordinary sounds, but no longer the sounds of solidity. Owen closed the door softly and let the darkness settle around him. For the first time in years, he felt not only the weight of survival, but the stirrings of something else, something fragile and unspoken, like new shoots breaking through wet earth after a storm. The storm had given life back to the desert, but it had also left work behind. For days, Owen and Hope mended fences, cleared mud from the corral, and hauled fallen boards back into place. Their hands grew blistered, their clothes stained with clay. Yet they worked side by side without complaint. Each night they collapsed at the table, too weary for talk. But the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of people who had endured something together. The goats thrived on new shoots of grass that sprang from the sodden ground. Their bleats sharper now, their ribs less visible. Even the garden plot, long a barren patch, showed signs of stirring. Ope knelt in the damp soil one morning, sifting it through her fingers. There is strength still here, she said. It only needed rain. Owen watched her, the sun rising behind her shoulders, and thought she might as well have been speaking of herself. By the second week, he knew they must return to Tombstone for supplies. Flour was low, coffee nearly gone. Ope insisted on coming. If I hide here, she said, the town will talk worse. Better they see me beside you. Owen hesitated, but agreed. The ride into town was quiet, but waited. When they reached Main Street, conversation stilled, faces turned, whispers spread like brush fire. Ope sat tall beside him, her chin lifted, her stone grey eyes scanning the street without flinching. At the general store, Mrs. Henderson, the matronly boarding housekeeper, watched them closely, her mouth set in a tight line. Behind her daughter whispered with a friend, eyes darting toward Hope. At the livery, the Garrison brothers leaned against a post, exchanging smirks. She's prettier than we heard, one said loud enough for Owen to catch. Can't see her lasting long on that goat patch. Ope ignored them, though her grip tightened on the parcel she carried. At the church steps, Reverend Wallace paused, Bible in hand. His eyes lingered on Owen with suspicion, then on Hope with a kind of pity. He gave a stiff nod, nothing more. By the time they finished their errands, Owen's Joe watched from holding his silence. Ope walked steadily beside him, though the tightness around her mouth betrayed the strain. Only when they were in the wagon again, rolling away from town, did she speak. They see only what they expect, she said. To them, I am a scandal, and you are a curiosity. Nothing more. You bear it better than most would, Owen said. Her lips curved in a reline. I have had practice. I wanted to ask more, but her tone closed the subject. For a few weeks, the rhythm steadied again work at the homestead. Cautious trips into town. The townsfolk gossiped, but gossip was wind. It blew fierce at first, then scattered. Owen thought perhaps the worst had passed. Then one September morning, a stranger rode into the yard. Owen was repairing the barn roof when he heard the hoofbeats measured, deliberate, not the loping gait of a ranch horse, but the proud stride of something bred for show. He climbed down, hammer still in hand. The rider was a tall man, broad-shouldered, dressed in a black coat despite the heat. His horse was a glossy thoroughbred, its tack polished to a shine. The man dismounted with practiced ease, tying the reins to the post as if he owned the place. His pale eyes swept the yard before settling on Owen. You'd be Owen, he said. His voice was smooth, cultured, carrying the confidence of money. Owen stood silent, the hammer loose in his grip. The man smiled, though it never reached his eyes. Edward McGra from Missouri. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Before Owen could answer, the cabin door opened. Opie stepped out with a pail of water. The moment she saw the stranger, the color drained from her face. The pail slipped from her hands, water spilling into the dust. "Hello, Opie," McGrath said pleasantly as though greeting a wayward acquaintance. "You led me a long chase." "You have no right to be here," Hope said, though her voice trembled. On the contrary, he reached into his coat and drew out a folded document. "Your father owed me $15,000. I signed this contract, binding you in settlement of the debt. That makes you mine." "I am no one's property," she said, her chin lifting despite the fear in her eyes. McGrath's smile widened. "The law disagrees. Contracts are binding. And you ran before our marriage could be properly sealed." "That's fraud, Miss Donovan." "She is my wife now," Owen said quietly, stepping forward. Amy Segra glanced at him. "Dismissive wife hardly. There is no record of such a union filed in this territory. No church ceremony, no certificate, just an arrangement. I let the word linger with a man the law hardly considers a citizen." The word struck hard, but Owen did not flinch. Opie's voice had sharpened. "Even if such a contract were legal, it was made without my consent. I never signed it." "Consent." Amy Segra gave a short laugh. "Your father's signature was enough. I offered you. He accepted and I paid. That's how business is done." Owen's hand tightened on the hammer. "Leave this land." McGra's eyes narrowed, his pleasant mask slipping. "Careful of Pike. You wouldn't want to make a mistake that costs you more than goats and dust. I have friends in Tombstone, judges, sheriffs, men who respect law and money. I will be back, and when I am, she'll come with me. One way or another." He swung into the saddle, his black horse stamping impatiently. "Enjoy your time together. It won't last." Dust rose behind him as he rode away. Opie sank to her knees where the water had spilled, her hands trembling. Owen crouched beside Ether, but she flinched at his touch. "$15,000, she whispered. "I didn't know the debt was so much. He didn't know he would." She broke off, pressing her hands to her face. "He thought running would be enough." "He thought you are not going back," Owen said. "You don't understand. He has searched his desperate. He has power. He ruined others before. There was a girl, another debt, another promise. She tried to run too. They found her body in the river." Owen's jaw clenched. "I will not touch you." "How can you promise that?" she asked, voice breaking. "You said once you would not risk another loss." "Well, here it is. The loss is coming for you." Without thinking, he pulled her against him. "He was a coward," he said into her hair. "He hid behind my grief, used it as an excuse to stop living. But you changed that. You made me want again, feel again. He will not let fear take this from us." Opie drew back, searching his face. For the first time since she stepped off the train, she let herself lean into him, if only for a moment. The desert wind swept across the yard, carrying with it the dust of old promises and new battles. In the distance, thunder rumbled again, not of rain, but of conflict approaching. Word of McGra's visit spread through Tombstone faster than wildfire across dry grass. Waiting days, every saloon, boarding house, and church pew carried the tale. A banker from Missouri had ridden out to the Apache's goat ranch, waving papers that claimed his bride was no bride at all, but property bought and paid for. By the third morning, Sheriff Harris himself rode to Owen's homestead. Dust rose behind his bay horse as he dismounted in the yard, his weathered face serious. Owen met him there, arms folded across his chest. Opie stood at the doorway, pale but unflinching. The sheriff tipped his hat toward her before turning to Owen. "Amy Segra is stirring the town into knots. Says he's got contracts proving claim to the lady. Hope Wallace called for a hearing. You both best come in and speak your piece before this breaks into something worse." O whence your titan? Where's for who? The serif side. For everyone. Let the court hear it plain. Better that than whispers and pistols. Opes has flickered, but she nodded. We llegó. That afternoon, their wagon rolled into Tombstone. The streets were lined with faces, men leaning on railings, women whispering from porches, children scampering for a look. The adobe courthouse, normally quiet, bulged with townsfolk. Inside, the air was thick with sweat and judgment. Jorge Wallace sat at the front, his white hair catching the light, his eyes sharp as knives. Sheriff Harris kept a watchful stance at his side. Secreto was already there, dressed in a black coat despite the heat, his polished boots shining. A lawyer from Tucson beside him with a satchel of papers. The banker carried himself like a man, convinced the world bent to his will. Owen and Hope took their places at the front, every gaze in the room following them. Murmurs rose and fell like restless wind. Mrs. Henderson clutched her daughter's hand and whispered pointedly. The Garrison brothers lounged against the wall, smirking as though waiting for a fist fight. Reverend Wallace, a stiff bucket, stood with his Bible, eyes darting between the Apache and the stranger. When the judge rapped his gavel, silence fell heavy. We are gathered to hear the claim of Edward McGra against Hope Donovan, now residing with Owen. Speak plain. Sheriff will keep order. McGra stood smoothly, producing the folded document. His voice was rich, practiced. Your Honor, here lies a contract signed by Miss Donovan's father, binding her to me in settlement of his debt. 15,000 pesos paid in full. She fled before the agreement was sealed in marriage. I stand now to reclaim what is legally mine. I laid the paper before the judge and his lawyer stepped forward to reinforce the claim. By Missouri law, her father's signature sufficiency so guardianship is binding. The young woman's flight constitutes fraud. The words rang loud, the crowd stirring uneasily. The judge's eyes moved to Hope. Miss Donovan, you may answer. She rose slowly, hands trembling, then steadied herself. Her voice carried through the room with surprising strength. That contract was made without my consent. I was no child. I was 20 years old yet never asked for my signature. My father's debt was his own, not mine. Macrat sought to settle money with flesh. I left because I refused to be owned. Whatever law Missouri clings to, here I am, my own person. I chose to live free. Her words cut through the murmurs. So many women in the benches nodded, others looked scandalized. Mrs. Henderson hissed to her daughter, but the girl's eyes shone with something close to admiration. Owen rose then, pulling a folded paper from his vest. His voice was steady, low, but clear. This morning, Reverend Wallace married us, witnessed by Sheriff Harris. We are husband and wife under the law of this territory. No claim holds against her now. Gasps moved across the crowd. Reverend Wallace shifted uncomfortably but raised his hand. It is true. He performed the ceremony at dawn. The licenses filed in this courthouse. The room erupted in whispers. Mkra's face hardened. As sham, he spat. A rushed scheme to cheat me. Owen met his gear. She is not yours. She is her own. She chose to stand with me. The judge studied the documents a long moment, then set them down. His voice rang sharp. A contract signed without the woman's hand holds no weight in Arizona. This territory does not treat women as cattle. Whatever Missouri may claim, its reach ends at its borders. And as of this morning, Hope Donovan is Hope Owen, wife under the law. Secreto, your claim is no. The court rules in her favor. It brought the gavel down hard. Case dismissed. The hall buzzed with voices. Some cheered quietly. Others muttered. The Garrisons cursed under their breath. Disappointed at the lack of gunplay. Reverend Wallace, Salim, gave a small nod, as if conceding that even Apache and scandal carried truth. Ope exhaled sharply, shoulders easing for the first time in weeks. But McGra was not finished. He gathered his papers, his lawyer hurrying at his elbow. His pale as burned as he turned to them. Do you think this is done? I have friends in Tucson, in Phoenix, in places where influence means more than sentiment. You will regret crossing me. Ope steady now met his gaze. You already lost, Edward. You lost the day you thought money bought a soul. Mkra's face twisted. He spun on his heel, strode out, and mounted his black horse. Dust rose as he galloped from town, his threats fading with the sound of hoofs. For a long moment, the courtroom lingered in murmurs. Then, Sheriff Harris clapped a hand to Owen's shoulder. You stood tall. Both of you. Some here will still whisper, but truth's got a way of settling in deeper than lies. Owen gave a short nod. Ope slipped her arm through his, surprising him with the firmness of her grip. Together they walked into the sunlight. Townsfolk watched openly now, some with newfound respect, others with scorn, but the difference no longer mattered. She walked beside him, not as scandal, not as property, but as a woman who had spoken her own truth before them all. As the wagon carried them out of town, Reverend Wallace stepped onto the boardwalk. He pressed his Bible to his chest and inclined his head, a gesture that carried more weight than any sermon. Ope saw it, and her lips curved in the faintest fight. The desert stretched ahead, vast and harsh, but no longer empty. For the first time since she had stepped off the train, she felt not only determined, but free. Owen, too, felt the silence between them shift. It was not the silence of strangers, nor the silence of fear. It was the silence of two people who had claimed their right to stand together, whatever storms lay ahead. The weeks after the hearing passed like the slow settling of dust after a storm. Amy Segura had ridden out of Tombstone in disgrace, and the whispers lingered, no one had seen him since. Some said he went back east to lick his wounds. Others swore he stayed in Tucson, plotting lawsuits and schemes. But as autumn stretched across the desert, his shadow began to fade in. What remained was the daily life of the ranch, hard and ordinary, yet different now, because Owen and Hope no longer lived as two strangers, bound by agreement. They were husband and wife, by law and by choice. Hope's touch began to shape the homestead. Curtains appeared at the cabin windows, sewn from old flour sacks she bleached and dyed with wildflower roots. A shelf by the stove filled with jars of beans and corn she had put up herself. She coaxed the garden back to life with quiet persistence, turning the damp soil left by the flood into neat rows of winter greens. Obin, who had long believed the land barren, was astonished to see green shoots rising where dust had ruled for years. One evening he returned from mending a far fence to find Hope on the porch. A quilt draped over her shoulders, gazing at the sunset. The sky burned gold and crimson behind the mountains. She looked at him and said softly, "This place no longer feels like exile, it feels like home." He said nothing at first, only sat beside her and let the silence speak. But inside, a weight he had carried since San Carlos seemed to lift. The town too shifted in its manner toward them. Mrs. Henderson still frowned whenever Hope passed, but her daughter offered a smile. The garrisons kept their distance, though less bold in their talk. Reverend Wallace, stiff as ever, nodded when they crossed paths, which was more than he had done before. Sheriff Harris stopped by one once, checking the corral and sharing coffee, his presence a quiet show of support. Slowly, respect took root where suspicion had been. As the nights grew colder, Owen and Hope worked side by side, preparing for winter. They reinforced the barn, split mows quite for the stove, and stacked hay high enough to last until spring. One afternoon, as they stored the last bundle, snowflakes began to drift from a gray scar and fleeting in Arizona, but enough to coat the ground in white for a single night. Ope stood in the yard, her face upturned, catching flakes on her lashes. She laughed clear and free, and Owen felt the sound sink into places in his heart. A thought long dead. Later that evening, they sat by the fire, the cabin warm with the smell of stew. Ope spoke of selling vegetables in town come spring, of maybe keeping hens for eggs, of saving for more goats. Her eyes shone not with survival alone, but with plans, and Owen realized she no longer spoke of your ranch, but our ranch. It struck him then how far they had come from the weary silence of their first supper to this moment of shared dreaming. One morning, not long before Christmas, Owen found Hope on the hill above the cabin, standing before two modest wooden markers. Martha's grave was there, and the tiny marker for the child Owen had lost. He had never brought Hope there, never spoken much of it. Yet she had found it, wildflowers in her hands. She knelt and placed them gently on the earth. When he approached, she did not turn, but spoke softly. She was love. I can feel it. And she left you enough love to carry forward. I will honor that, Owen. I promise. For a long time they stood together in silence, the wind whispering through dry grass. He felt no sting of jealousy from her words, only a quiet reverence. Something closed in him that had long been raw, as though grief itself had been given rest. Through the cold months they settled into a rhythm. At dawn, Hope stoked the stove while Owen hauled water. By day they labored in fields and fence, often without words, but with the steady companionship of people who no longer needed to prove themselves. At night they shared the warmth of the same fire, the same table, and finally the same bed. The narrow walls of the cabin, once echoing with loneliness, now pulsed with the quiet harmony of two hearts learning to beat together. By February, neighbors who had kept their distance began stopping by. The Alvarez family brought over cutings of moose quite for fuel. A prospector from the hills traded venison for beans. Mrs. Henderson, stiff-backed and sharp-eyed, arrived one morning with a basket of flour, muttering about excess stock, though everyone knew it was her way of conceding Hope's place. The isolation that had wrapped Owen's life for years was loosening. The ranch was no longer a monument to survival alone, but a part of the community, however grudgingly accepted. In March, when the first tender shoots of corn broke through the soil, Owen and Hope stood side by side watching them. The desert was still harsh, still dangerous, but in that moment it felt forgiving. Hope slipped her hand into his, her storm-gray eyes reflecting the morning light. "Every choice I made led me here," she said quietly. "I don't regret any of it." He turned his rough palm against hers and answered with words that came easier now than once they had. "I love you." She smiled, her lips trembling, and said, "And I love you, Owen, not for saving me, but for letting me belong." As spring stretched across the land, they built new dreams. Plans for more goats, for hens and vegetables, for perhaps children one day. They spoke of them not with fear, but with hope, as though the desert itself had granted permission. By early summer, Tombstone had a new story to tell. No longer was Hope Donovan, the runaway bride chased by a banker. She was Hope Owen, the woman who stood before a court and claimed her freedom. The woman who tamed loneliness with courage, and Owen, once whispered about as the Apache hermit, became the man who built a home worth more than any contract or rumor. On a warm evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, Owen lifted Hope into his arms and carried her across the porch, though they had been married for months. She laughed against his shoulder, the sound bright as water in the desert. Being them, the first stars pricked the sky. Ancient witnesses to lives that endured. The ranch no longer stood as a place of sorrow, but as proof of what could be remade out of grief, out of dust, out of the stubborn will to begin again. The desert would always test them. Drought would return. Storms would tear through, and perhaps old enemies might rise again. But together they had faced silence, flood, gossip, and false claims. And together they had endured. The land harsh and merciless had given them its first true gift, each other. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of this story. I'm truly glad you stayed with me. Your support means so much. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel so I can keep bringing you more heartfelt stories like this.